Ta-da!
Hello gamers, Matthew here from Grey Army Gaming in Lund, Sweden. For today's episode of Musings of a Philogamer, we will be looking at the topic of where are the women wargamers on male normativity, exemplars, and gender inclusivity in wargaming. Before we get started, I would just like to direct your attention to the greyarmygaming.com website, where you can go and download this essay if you would like to look at it and read along with us here, or look at it later. Please go visit the Downloads tab on the top of the website and click there, and you will be directed to this essay. The question with which I would like to lead off our discussion today is simply this: where are the women wargamers? Although I do not have concrete statistics regarding the number or percentage of women who participate in tabletop games such as Warhammer Fantasy, anecdotal evidence supports what is apparent to anyone involved in the hobby, namely that women are conspicuously underrepresented. But what exactly accounts for the apparent lack of interest in the hobby among females? Undoubtedly, one important factor is the exclusionary force of the covert and even at times overt sexism and misogyny that are at play in certain aspects of wargaming. This topic is an important one that we will reserve for a separate Musings of a Philogamer episode. Today I would like to focus instead on what I suggest are two other crucial components underlying this issue. First, the exclusionary male normativity at play in fantasy wargaming, and second, the paucity of female exemplars within the hobby. My claim is that this twofold dynamic reinforces the unfortunate narrative that the wargaming universe is for the most part not a place for girls and women. Ultimately, this leaves the hobby far less vibrant than it would otherwise be were gender inclusivity to be fully embraced. Let us begin with the concept of normativity in general. One definition of normative is as follows: of or relating to a norm, especially an assumed norm regarded as the standard of correctness in behavior, speech, writing, etc. To make this definition more concrete, consider the normativity at play in a typical job interview. Within this context, it is taken for granted that one arrives early, dresses in a certain presentable manner, uses polite language, shows interest and engagement, and so forth. What we see in this example is that normativity is descriptive in the sense that it describes what is to be understood as normal within a specific context, but also prescriptive in that it plays a crucial role in conforming beliefs and behaviors to the norm. Although many forms of normativity, such as that at work in the job interview, are rather harmless, other forms, in contrast, are quite nefarious. One example of the latter is a certain type of male normativity characterized by harmful exclusivity, in which maleness as a gender category is taken as the norm that thereby judges all other gender categories such as female, androgynous, or agendered to be little more than lesser valued deviations. In turning now to the Warhammer Fantasy universe, I would like to develop the claim that underlying this universe is indeed a certain kind of exclusionary male normativity. For many gamers, this claim may at first glance seem far-fetched, in that there certainly appears on the surface to be no such dynamic at play. In response, it is important to point out that because norms are for the most part uncritically absorbed through the process of socialization, normativity in most cases remains invisible. Although this is no less true in the case of fantasy wargaming, I would suggest that male normativity within such a gaming context nevertheless begins to become visible at the same time that one begins, paradoxically, to focus on female invisibility. Put differently, the dearth of female representation within Warhammer Fantasy becomes itself an important indicator of the reality of the normative status of maleness therein. Consider two examples in support of this point. First, female figurines are certainly not emphasized within the Warhammer Fantasy collection to the same extent as their male counterparts. To be fair, there are a few powerful female characters such as the Wood Elf Ariel or the High Elf Alariel, as well as a handful of female units such as the Sisters of Avalorn, the Sisters of the Thorn, and the Sisters of Slaughter. These cases, however, are the exceptions that prove the rule. The overwhelming number of Warhammer Fantasy figures are either male or possess what are clearly masculine characteristics. Second, and more significantly, real-life women are conspicuously missing from the Games Workshop Warhammer Fantasy literature, and particularly from the staged photo representations of painters, gamers, and gaming situations. A good example of this phenomenon is the large 8th edition rulebook. On numerous pages we are shown stills of men selecting armies, painting figurines, playing games, setting up terrain, celebrating with post-game beverages, competing in tournaments, participating in events, and perhaps most importantly, guiding and directing young boys who are starting out in the hobby. Women, however, are nowhere to be found. Given this discussion of normativity, we are now at a place where we can venture our first response to the title question of this essay. In short, I would argue that one crucial reason more women are not involved in fantasy gaming is due to the manner by which male normativity has systematically excluded them from the hobby. In the case of figurines, the lack of women sends the implicit message that female warriors are either not on par with their male counterparts, or they are simply not supposed to be found, at least not in as great of numbers, on a Warhammer battlefield. It requires no stretch of the imagination to see how this exclusionary normative message is easily transferred from figurines to potential female players. In addition, in the case of Games Workshop literature, the lack of visual representation of women likewise sends the implicit message that Warhammer is a game designed only for men, to be played only by men, and to be taught only to boys. Of course, an objector might be thinking, well, this latter case need not be indicative of an exclusionary male normativity. Rather, perhaps there simply were no women who were a part of the design team, who were active in events, and who were interested in learning about the hobby when the literature was produced. In response, I think it is important to note that the gender representation found in the likes of the 8th edition rulebook is still something that had to be intentionally chosen, and that could very well have been otherwise. And in this choice, we see not only the manifestation, but also the propagation of a normativity that excludes girls and women. Let us turn now to the topic of the relative paucity of female exemplars within the wargaming hobby. In order to understand precisely why this point is significant for understanding the apparent lack of interest in the hobby among females, we may begin with a brief discussion of exemplars, modeling, and identity. One of the crucial functions of exemplars is to provide something of a blueprint for human socialization, by which individuals develop their personal identity within the social context. As scholars Donald Gibson and Diana Cordova describe it, modeling assumes identification on the part of an observer with a model. By identification is meant the desire of an individual observer to enhance perceived similarity to another person, to assimilate aspects of the role model's attitudes, behaviors, and values, and ultimately to occupy the role model's life situation. In other words, role models play the crucial part of providing us with the telos or goal towards which we direct our existential growth. We literally develop into what we are shown is possible for us to become. In cultivating the virtue of self-control, for example, one never does so in a vacuum, but rather one attempts to become self-controlled in the manner modeled by such figures as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., teachers, parents, and so on and so forth. Selfhood, therefore, can be thought of as a form of discipleship. Given this dynamic in which the formation of the self depends to a significant degree upon what is presented by others, we can see just how problematic the situation is in which positive role models are largely, if not entirely, lacking. In such cases, the issue is precisely that an individual rarely becomes something which he or she has never thought of as an option, or perhaps something that he or she could not even have imagined as an existential possibility. For the person bereft of positive exemplars, the future is simply not open in the manner it would otherwise have been, had the path to selfhood already been well trodden by others. A good example of this dynamic in relation to women is that of philosophy itself. The traditional narrative of philosophy runs from Socrates through Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, etc., etc. And although women have been active within this process, they have largely, though not entirely, been relegated to the margins. The consequence of such marginalization within the philosophical tradition has been that generations of female students have seen no place for themselves within the discipline, and thereby have simply refrained from pursuing it. Fortunately, thinkers such as Elizabeth Anscombe, Simone de Beauvoir, and more recently Martha Nussbaum have been influential in challenging and overturning the traditional narrative with the clear message that both men and women belong in philosophy. When we return now to wargaming, we see how at play here is a similar dynamic to that of historical philosophy concerning the paucity of exemplars. Whereas boys and men, from the inception of fantasy gaming, have been presented with a plethora of male role models, whether fathers, brothers, teachers, or even the men down at the local game store. Models who have paved a clear path by which such boys and men have been led into the hobby. Girls and women, in contrast, historically have by and large had no such exemplars. Given our discussion above concerning the fundamental link between exemplars and identity, we are now at a position where we may offer a second response to the title question of this essay. In short, I would argue that another crucial reason more women are not involved in fantasy wargaming is that in light of the paucity of female wargaming exemplars, the path into such wargaming remains largely obscure. Put it another way, for girls and women who rarely, if ever, have been presented with a concrete role model about what it means to possess the identity marker of female wargamer, existential development in such a direction is but a faint possibility. Nevertheless, just as with philosophy in recent decades, this situation concerning exemplars in wargaming is slowly beginning to change. More and more women have been emerging as important figures within wargaming. Women including Miranda with Wargamer Girl, Gwyn with Mini Wargaming, and Karen with Dark Wizard Gaming. This is indeed a hopeful trend. But of course, there still remains much ground that needs to be covered and much that still needs to be done. To conclude this discussion, we may briefly touch upon the importance of gender inclusivity. On a strictly fiscal and business level, adopting a policy of inclusivity should be a no-brainer for companies such as Games Workshop. With its current model, in which it has from the beginning been largely unable to connect with girls and women, Games Workshop is unfortunately missing out on half of its potential market. As such, although the recent hope for Games Workshop has been that the Age of Sigmar will revitalize its fantasy line, if my argument here is correct, then a different age, perhaps something along the lines of the Age of Sigmar and Signy, paired with an aggressive campaign to represent girls and women within this universe, would prove even more effective for such revitalization. More significant than the fiscal issue, however, is that adoption of gender inclusivity is important precisely in that it works against a system that unjustly marginalizes and excludes girls and women from the hobby. In the end, the hope is that such inclusivity will help to foster greater numbers of female wargaming exemplars who can be embraced and supported within the fantasy community as the pioneers who are blazing a trail for future generations of female wargamers. And by addressing the underrepresentation of women in wargaming in this fashion, we may all look towards a future where fantasy gaming is richer and more vibrant than it has ever been. Thank you for joining us here today at Grey Army Gaming, where Grey can always play.